Notes. Welcome everyone to our weekly call. So we've got a good spread of people on the call today. So thank you all for joining. We don't have a specific theme for today for the call. Although I should mention that in a couple of weeks' time, we're likely to be spending some time talking about ECH. So we just advance notice, we won't have a call next week. That's the 16th. Because I'll be taking a week's vacation. Sadly not in Madeira, which was my plan. As a brief aside, in a 5-star hotel with a 2-star Michelin restaurant. My wife decided she didn't fancy flying after all. So instead of that, we're going to a bed and breakfast in Snowdonia for a week, which is not quite the same as Madeira. Particularly at the moment. So I think it'll be Madeira for another time. But anyway, I digress. So we'll be away next week, back the week after to sort of talk about ECH. So just bear that in mind. What I thought it might be useful to start with this week was just really a continuation of the discussion that sort of commenced on our call last week when Barbara, I think, was suggesting that it would be useful to create a document and maybe sort of publish it through the EDI list, because it might prove too hard to do, and probably out of scope of the charter, to be fair, for the ADD working group on IETF. So to instead sort of, publish it through the EDI group to try and get some sort of, I guess, best practice, I think, Barbara, sort of documented and out there. So I wondered if it might be worthwhile just pushing that conversation a little here to see if there are some potential contributors that could help to really get that effort moving positively. So I don't,
okay.
You might not want to do that, and that's completely fine, but I thought it might.
No, that's fine.
Harness a bit of effort from the group to contribute to such a document.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think, at some point, somehow we also need to get back to the discussion of mechanisms for conveying additional information related to to network policy. That was something that had a lot of discussion, and the discussion led to ADD won't define actual bits that say this is the policy, but it could design something that's intended to perhaps convey, where others could then define what certain bits mean, maybe register things in an IANA registry or something like that and define what they mean. But at the very least, I think there also needs to be some mechanism for conveying the network policy. And, as I think about it, it probably shouldn't be ADD because, while DNS policy is one thing, it seems like maybe it's more than just DNS policy. It's a variety of network policy. This network filters this network, things like that. What?
Was someone trying to come in then, or was that just someone not muted without realizing it?
Okay.
No, I think that was an unintentional interruption, Barbara.
That's fine. So anyway, but I was kind of pretty much done with that thought, and I'm kind of curious what others are thinking, and maybe, crowdsourcing what might be an approach, because there are various approaches.
Okay, so what do other people think in terms of sort of scope for such a document? Because I think Barbara is spot on that the ADD charter does allow for the conveyance of information, but certainly not its interpretation. And as I recall, nothing in there at all about the scope of the information either. But it would seem like sort of producing a document which sort of set out.
Look, Glenn raised his hand.
Yeah, okay, Glenn, do you want to come in on that thought?
Sure. I'm not sure I'm going to be helpful, but I'm going to point out for us to understand where this sort of hit some walls last time when we started down a little bit of this conversation. So when we started talking about, and conveyance is part of the charter, sure. There emerged a problem about a year ago when some people started talking about this space around the need for authenticated information versus unauthenticated information. And if you remember, this was also tied at the time to some discussions around, well, can we even use DHCP? Because DHCP can't be trusted. We need somebody to trust this stuff. And this then brought up a lot of history at the IETF around several efforts that have tried to have a sort of a more trustworthy version of DHCP through various means and mechanisms. As we sort of discuss how would you proceed with this, because I like the idea. I'm not trying to squash that idea. I'm not trying to derail it, but I'm saying avoiding that sort of let's go off and solve authentication debacle, because you can't. I've become somewhat jaded around authentication through the years. It's hard, and if we try to tackle that aspect of it, then we'll get mired in all that history. So maybe it's better to pull back and say, okay, we're not going to deal with authenticated portions of that. We're not going to deal with that requirement. We're going to deal with the stuff you can actually do today with the tools we have, with slight tweakings and slight extensions. But we will refuse to allow ourselves to get driven down the authenticated space, unless there's for small things, unless there's like simple versions of it, and things like citing authorities for like information, right? That's not quite authentication, it's validation and integrity checking. And if we split that difference, maybe there's a path there that makes this thing work pretty well. But that's my 2 cents. And so,
okay.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was about to note that Bill's raised his hand, but Barbara, do.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, authentication is way overdue from my point of view. I need it. I know not a lot of other people who need it. We've got Dane, TLS client auth is there and has been working just fine for 25 years. There's no magic here. And I am all for breaking things up into bite-sized pieces so that we don't create unnecessary conflict between people who view them different ways. I really, really like to see RFCs that just say, yes, we agree that we use the existing building blocks in the expected way. We are not inventing anything new here, and we are not trying to, throw in the kitchen sink. So I am all for breaking up authenticated and unauthenticated into separate things, but I absolutely need the authenticated as soon as possible.
So can I respond to that, Andrew?
Yeah, sure, fire away.
So one of the challenges in the authentication space, there's a lot of debate and directions people go. But for this conversation, let me sort of focus on network devices, in particular, things like CPE and other client side things that are in the home, which are very hard to upgrade. It's been pointed out, even if you box it up and send it to a customer and say, unbox it, plug it in, nothing else needs to be done, it still won't get done in many cases. Or if you say, go buy your own and plug it in, it's a very difficult process. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult.
Yeah.
The reality is we end up with millions of these devices out there, which are very hard to evolve and upgrade. So if we say that, okay, we can't do that space, then what we've sort of recently been doing at the IETF, it seems, is saying, well, fine, we can't do it at the network device level, but if we don't do it at the network level, but instead we bump everything up to more of a client and web interaction level. Then we can build this more securely. And that's sort of in my mind a little bit where Doe came from. It's like, well, we can't get this done at this lower level in what is DNS today. Let's bump it up and make it a web transaction with URLs and stuff between the webosphere can get that job done. And so if we look at authentication and how we do it,
we already had
that result is bumping it up. Sorry, go ahead.
But we already did it. We already had DOT. That's not a valid argument.
So wait, let me interject here in along those lines of where Glenn is going, in that, so the network policy I really care about is the one that comes from my home router. And there is not a certificate authority in this world who I trust to tell me whether or not a certificate in my home router is valid as my home router. And so that is the main problem that needs to be solved.
Right, but we've already had Dane for 10 years, and that Dane solves that, right? So all we have to do is use the existing pieces in the expected ways and not throw in extra arguments about oh, but it might be difficult for IoT people. I couldn't care less whether it's difficult for IoT people. It's gonna be difficult anyway. If you've got 10 million devices out there, yes, everything is difficult, but that doesn't mean that we need a more complicated solution.
We need a solution that's under the control of the home network owner.
Well, for some things, yes. So we need a building block that works either way. We need a building block that works for people doing IoT, it works for people doing home networking, it works for people, who are doing private recursive resolvers, right? And so we've already got all the pieces. We've got TLS auth, we've got Dane, we've got DOT, right? All we need to do is implement all three of those and we're done. Implement them in an interoperable way and confirm that they are interoperating correctly, right? We don't actually need any new standardization here.
How does Dane work in my home network? I'm really not understanding. Maybe I don't know. Again, I don't trust the internet. I don't trust any Cloudflare, Google, ISP, DNS resolver, or anything as it relates to my home network.
Right, so you can generate your own cert and you can use Dane to find it from your devices and use it for authenticating your devices to your devices and ignore anything from CAs as a man-in-the-middle attack. Perfect.
But if all of the applications are using Doe, how in the world are they going to find anything that actually has any Dane certificates related to my home network?
Well, if we have a malicious application that is intentionally avoiding the standards-based, user-defined preference, then, the answer, I think, is you try not to use such an application. And you try and block it at the network level. But I don't know, Vixie, Paul has much better rants on that than I do.
Yeah, I was going to say, Paul literally had his hand up, and that maybe is a good point to ask Paul for your sort of take on that.
So you guys are speaking truth as I know it, and it's rational and should prevail and won't. The internet is viral now. So the fact is there's a lot of money to be made by treating the end user's network as part of a cohesive whole that belongs more to, I don't know, the ISP or Apple or Akamai or whatever than it does to the end user. So, you're coming from a history where the internet was a network of networks, and each one of those networks was considered autonomous and would be making its own decisions and would treat the internet as sort of an adjunct, a thing that you might also wish to access. That time is gone. And there will not be a device maker, a browser maker, or anybody who is going to invest in an approach that makes those networks as independent as they once were. And without that investment, without big companies who stand to make money by doing it, it won't happen. And so, yes, I agree with Bill. Dane could be made to do this, although it's a little bit viral because you're counting on having a global unique domain name for that router. And that in itself means you have to be part of the system before you can participate this way. Well, you go ahead when I'm done here. The solution that we can actually push forward, and I think this is what Glenn was trying to get to, and as far as the ADD working group, the solution we can push for is the one that preserves the ability of huge companies to make a lot of money by subordinating our autonomy to their profit. And if we try to do something that is not that, we're going to find that we're pushing on a rope and that no one will argue, but also no one will agree. You know, I call your attention to the IAB's decision 25 years ago that NAT was bad and should not be standardized. That's not the way the world works. Thank you.
Now, I see, well, two comments in the chat. Firstly, I suspect Glenn might want to come back in a moment to clarify what the point he was driving at, in case it's been misinterpreted. But also, I see Tommy, you seem to be in broad agreement with Bill that the problem's solvable, subject to client devices cooperating. Do you want to just elaborate on that a little?
I was simply trying to verify my understanding. It seems like what was being said is all the technologies needed for authentication to local network resources is solvable with existing mechanisms if the client devices are in on the game, that they're cooperating, and not that there was some thing that I was missing. Because I think the problem, as Barbara has mentioned, that has previously been discussed is when the client shows up with no knowledge of the network. And so it's trying to differentiate those two, make sure there wasn't, but anyway. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess if we've got the right building blocks, which I think, again, is broadly speaking what Bill seemed to be suggesting, and I think Paul potentially was agreeing to, then the trick is to find a way of communicating between those building blocks, which I think it would be the task of this activity, to convey the right information so that hopefully they can make sort of decisions to do the right thing. Separate sort of discussion whether that will apply in every case, but at least then there's a path to do that.
So I was kind of wondering if it would make sense to maybe define like a DNSSD service that could be defined so as to provide network policy information. And that's kind of what I was thinking. I mean, certainly it could be done using DHCP options, but I was also thinking of DNSSD as a slightly more robust mechanism, but you know, you could also do both. And I was kind of wondering what people thought of, so the conveyance mechanism, so to speak.
Yeah, and is that on the conveyance side? Darryl, I know you had your hand up and then dropped it down again, but from your comment, is that what you were going to come in with?
Yeah, that was it. Nothing more.
Yeah, you're a little faint, but I think we got that. Okay, so if that's the sort of the task then to provide that mechanism, is there an appetite to help with that, or even an interest in solving that problem? Perhaps that might be a better starting question.
I mean, if it would be useful, I might, you know, kind of try and just throw together a draft that I wouldn't submit yet. And like, you know, I had kind of a first reading of my last draft here, and that was really useful, Andrew. You know, maybe I could have a first reading here on your call. And I would kind of suggest, you know, how it could be done using DHCP, and I could suggest how it might be done using DNSSD. Just to throw an idea out there, because nothing ever happens if nobody ever throws the idea out there.
Yeah, a blank page is never a good place to start.
Circular discussion is usually my favorite, but well.
I mean, that sounds suspiciously like that could then take us in the direction that's come up on the call in the past, in terms of a problem that does need to be solved. I know Vinny, for example, is not on the call, but I think he's raised this previously. Certainly, I think Paul has been quite passionate about the importance of sort of communicating and hopefully then accepting the sort of local network policies and so on. So I would like to think that there'd be a number of us, Barbara, that would then be interested in contributing. Now, I think probably it would take it outside of the scope of the ADD working group, but as was discussed on the call last week, it doesn't need to be in the IETF, or if it is in the IETF, it doesn't need to be within the ADD working group necessarily, but it would certainly be solving a problem that will be a useful problem to solve.
Right.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think, you know, that maybe getting some of that might then lead towards where I was trying to go with solving the overall home network, unmanaged network problem.
Yeah. Glenn,
let me jump back in, Andrew, for a minute. So, you know, a long time ago, a few of us kicked around this idea that in the end, what you really need is keep it simple, stupid, right? You know, if you had a JSON schema that said, here's how to express what you want to say, and then you had a way to deliver it, I don't know, put it up on a web server on the local network, maybe off the CPE, plus, you know, a protocol to, you know, point to it, whether that's, you know, I tell you about it via DHCP or some other magical means to basically say, here's where you go to get it, or it's just a well-known thing. You go retrieve it, right? And then what you need is, you know, from an engineering standpoint, a mechanism for the home network user to be able to edit, set, and you know, put stuff into that JSON policy that makes sense. And then you need the infrastructure, the clients and the devices that are on that network to go, oh, I know a well-known thing there. I'm going to read that JSON. Let's see what it has to say. What do you want to tell me? Do you want me to filter? Do you know, tell me the MAC addresses you want me to filter for? You know, all that kind of sort of gorp. That is where we, you know, the policy stuff we're trying to get across. I think building something like that would be very interesting. You know, if ultimately it ends up in the IETF, maybe, sure, why not, right? But maybe the work starts outside the IETF and you get enough people saying, this makes sense, let's go standardize it over at the IETF.
Yeah, more than one way to get to the right place.
But, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is we don't need to wait for an invitation from the IETF to go do something.
Yeah. Okay, well, it sounds like there's at least some interest in solving that problem and hopefully contributing to the solution as well. So Barbara, if you will be willing to at least give us that, can I still say straw man, straw person? That will be incredibly helpful. to then get some momentum behind this, and then we can maybe socialize that and see where it takes us.
Yeah, if it's going to be made of straw, I'll definitely have to keep those California utility companies away from it.
Yeah, very definitely.
I think Barbara's drafts have been great, and I'd love to see one on this topic.
Marvelous. I'll just see if anyone else wants to chip in with any thoughts, positive or negative. Otherwise, that sounds like a plan. That does indeed sound like a plan. Marvelous. All right. Well, hopefully that's something then we can all get behind and put some energy behind to sort of make some meaningful progress, even if it is a little outside of the ADD charter, but it's nevertheless a very worthwhile thing to solve. The other topic I was going to just mention, just changing slightly, one of the more interesting discussions, in my humble opinion, at the IETF was on the DNS error page, and the paper that, or two papers, in fact, that Dan presented a couple of weeks ago, which kicked off, I think, quite an intense discussion with some fairly strong feelings expressed by some about the IETF shouldn't be seen to be endorsing DNS censorship, which is one interpretation of doing filtering. But again, that felt to me, I mean, sort of stepping back from the specifics of the discussion during the working group, providing meaningful error messages to end users as to the reason why they can't get to particular content. So felt like absolutely the right thing to be trying to do from the user experience point of view. But it seemed to be getting bogged down from some strong feelings within the IETF.
I've just shared a page that I think deserves more attention from the people in the IETF, which is that the ship has sailed and protective DNS is out there and will not go away. And people who think that there shouldn't be a standard, shouldn't be censored, they can think what they want. And, so looking at DNSRPZ as a DNS firewall standard would be another example. It's not yet an RFC, but it will be. It's out there. There will not be honest DNS as a plurality of internet systems. There never, not ever. Thank you.
That's a timely article to point to. Thank you for that, Paul. So, Dan, as I see you on the call, I thought I would ask what your view is in terms of the sort of way forward with the paper. Or are you still waiting for sort of views to coalesce on the list?
No. We're gonna, so that part of, there were a couple of different objections for a couple different papers, and yeah, I agree that the biggest one was don't encourage DNS filtering. I agree with Paul, that ship sailed a long time ago and continues going around the world and through different oceans. And it reminds me of NAT. Where, gosh, we shouldn't do this, we should do the right thing. And I was involved heavily with NAT, as many of you recall. And, the nice thing with NAT was you could point at IPv6 and say, that's what we should do. But it didn't solve all the problems and still doesn't solve all the problems that NAT does. But the difficulty with saying don't do DNS filtering is we can't point at something else that is the IETF preferred mechanism like we could with NAT and IPv6. And that's that's another conundrum that IETF has, I would say, created for itself, because instead of, hear no evil, speak no evil, and see no evil, and just doing that, we haven't come up with anything better, like we did, where IPv6 could be argued as technically better than that. So some of the objections were just how we were combining things like network DNS only as a PBD flag into the split horizon document. We're moving that out into a separate document so that it can be small little pieces that are all individually acceptable, but effectively build or allow building that system that gives the network the ability to instruct the user why the network filtered something, so the user can abandon that network or stay connected to that network or whatever they'd like to do, which improves the state of the art that exists today. And thanks for your positive support at the meeting, by the way, Glenn, appreciate that. And then also allows the network to say, I would really rather you not try to subvert the DNS filtering that I have. And obviously, that's going to be a slippery slope of improving a lock and improving lock picking and improving a lock and improving lock picking as that goes forward. But the network intent can at least be signaled, and cooperating clients can cooperate, and the network will continue to get more sophisticated, just like antivirus, just like malware detection on every system that we all run. Continues to get better to detect attempts to circumvent that and decide that I have a non-cooperative device, so I will treat it appropriately. I'll deny it an IP address, I will route it nowhere, I will quarantine it, I will, or I'm just an inept network and I can't do those sorts of sophisticated things. And that's probably where, that's where I see this going.
So in terms of any sort of help and support, is there anything that you're looking for at the moment, or is that pretty much in hand, do you think?
I feel it's pretty much in hand. There's obviously going to continue being folks who object to DNS filtering, but filtering needs to happen somewhere, somehow. Governments want it, citizens want it, and starting with child porn and then going down the slippery slope from there to comments on Twitter we disagree with or whatever. And where does it stop? Don't know, but more data to the user is what we're trying to help with here. And it doesn't actually create the filtering. The filtering is created elsewhere. This is just trying to enlighten the user. But I appreciate the comments, that we got during my presentation and that we've received beforehand, that it encourages or incentivizes doing this filtering because now there would be a nicer, prettier way to show it to the user. But our alternatives are horrible with HTTPS being pervasive. If you try to be helpful and point the user to some bastion host that is in the ISP's control, and the ISP sent that fake A record to the client and tried to display a friendly little web page that says, oh, you can't get here because of this reason, and click here if you think it's bad, it was poorly filtered. That all just breaks with HTTPS in ways that are horrible. Click OK to accept this certificate, and everyone's going to have to do that in order to see those little pages. And that's what I'm seeing in enterprises, and that's what I'm seeing on guest networks, and that's what I see all over, and that's what made me want to spend the energy to move this forward.
Yeah, more user transparency feels like a good thing. Unsurprisingly, Peter has raised his hand. I suppose I say unsurprisingly, that's a bit harsh, but it's unsurprising to me that someone in DNS filter might have an opinion on this topic.
Thanks, and thanks to Dan. I didn't see the IETF presentation, I'm sorry, but this was raised on this chat, like I think back in May, and there were a few emails exchanged at the time. And I find it kind of crazy that there is any resistance to this, especially because it's not really, it's happening. It's more of just dealing with it in a nice way. And yeah, you know, companies like DNS Filter are obviously, and Quad9, Bill, you got your hand up as well, doing it. And, you know, I was doing DNS filtering on my local network 25 years ago. So this isn't exactly a new thing. It's just handling it nicely. I feel like I'm missing something though, because there was a bit of discussion, I think back in May, about the specifics of the implementation details and some particular use cases, like with branding. And, you know, I was talking about how the DNS filter does our block pages, and making sure that that was all kind of covered in the draft. And I probably need to do some research to make sure that I'm up to date. But is there a group or something that I should have joined, Dan, where we can give feedback?
Yeah, this is all in ADD, as I recall.
Okay.
Or could have been DNSOP. I'm sorry. Sorry, Mike.
But DNSOP.
Peter, the quickie is we have abandoned the returning an HTML page to the user in favor of returning a bunch of JSON to the user that and this is the dance we've been trying to avoid. What's the error code number for content filtering for child porn? Is it 22 or 28? And it's not really the number, but it's, you know, what are those categories, and how do we avoid that dance? Because we don't, that dance is hopeless, because, you know, everyone's got different categories, and can things only be in one category? Can they be in two? Oh my God, no. So I'm trying to find the appropriate caffeinated beverage to enjoy to get that kind of written up in a way that explains how we're avoiding that. And I haven't figured out how to do that yet, to be honest. But we do have a draft. It's called the structured DNS error. And that's the one that got a lot of positive feedback on the presentations during IETF week. Instead, and we're going to abandon the one that does effectively the same thing, but return an HTML page so that, you know, needed to solve all those branding problems and everything. That instead, this is some JSON, still has a JSON inside of it that points to a URL to report, you know, problems. And that would need to be, you know, handled and branded and look pretty and whatever. But that's further away from the technology of the protocol.
All right, thanks. I will look out for it and see if there's a way that we can give some feedback.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
And before I come to Bill, I see Barbara's comment about malware being a particularly useful aspect of this, which I would have thought uncontroversial until somebody, I won't say who it was in the IETF, questioned whether it was legitimate even to filter malware, as that was censorship, which depends on your point of view, I guess. But anyway, on that note, Bill, you wanted to come in.
And this is a bit of an aside, and I don't mean to turn it into its own conversation, but I just heard a reference to you know, browsers blocking connections to things with an invalid cert, and you know, we have all seen those error messages in browsers that say, you know, you're trying to connect to something and the cert doesn't, you know, cert's expired or whatever. And I think there's observation bias that happens because we've all seen them sometimes. We assume that that's a thing and that browsers are blocking connections to things that have invalid certs. Having both been bitten by this in a very public way, and also having now worked with browser vendors on this issue, as well as OS vendors, what I have discovered is that the ones that users get notified about are the tip of the iceberg, that the vast majority of invalid certificates that are presented to clients are honored rather than blocked and warned. and that is because the browser and OS, but mostly browser manufacturers, are in exactly the same position that DNS operators were with respect to DNSSEC validation before we started doing it on Quad 9 across the board, which is that they're in a race to the bottom. They believe that if they block something, users will switch to a different browser, which doesn't block them and doesn't bug them with an error message and won't come back, and that then they'll lose market share. So the vast majority of these things, they simply won't block, like not at all. It's off the table. And so the majority of my firsthand experience with this is in talking with them on behalf of Quad 9 and saying, we would like you to validate us, right? We would like you to validate that you're actually talking to Quad 9 when a user has specified Quad 9. And if you reach something that's not Quad 9, we want you to let the user know that their malware blocking is not going to be active. And flat out refusal across the board. Everyone refuses to do that because they say that, well, a vast portion of users are being man-in-the-middled all the time by different boxes. And, this touches on Paul's thing that, there should be a mechanism for doing site-specific security. Ideologically, I'm kind of aligned with Apple that that's fine, but the users should be informed that it's happening, right? I am fine with somebody who wants to use Quad 9 going to a location where Quad 9 is prohibited by policy and Quad 9 protection not being extended to them while they're in that location, as long as they know what the situation is. I'm 100% okay with that. But right now, nobody is willing to inform them because it would mean an interruptive modal dialog box or some damn thing, and they think they're going to lose market share if they do that. And I think that's really going to be the problem with adoption of DNS extended errors. So anyway, just a rant about that.
Thanks, Bill, and yeah, fair observation. The UI does count in this. Try not to read the chat, which is quite humorous at points, almost like we're back in IETF 111. Paul, you raised your hand.
I did, thank you. So not all agendas are worn on the outside of one's suit. And so, as I mentioned previously, the things that are going to be done are the ones that will make money or save money for a lot of people or companies or governments or something, not necessarily the things that might have technical merit according to some group of self-appointed people. When it comes to this extended error, or indeed any kind of signaling, as Bill, I think, rightly wants people to have, if they're not talking to the service they thought they were talking to, they should be told. I like that idea also. But here's the problem. If you have that signaling, then devices or users which try to evade it, which ignore that signaling, are somehow known to be doing so because it's explicit, right? They can't claim they didn't know. And the ability to claim that you didn't know is very important for those who, let's say, protect the rights of political dissidents around the world. In other words, if somebody evades ISP filtering and they knew, then they go to jail differently than if they evade ISP filtering and they can claim legitimately that they didn't know. The same will be true for IoT devices, which will bypass anything and everything that gets between them and their mothership. If they do so in the presence of explicit standardized signaling, then they will face various fines, regulatory problems, and so on. Or they might find themselves ripped out of the network and crushed, in my case. They would rather be able to claim that they did not know. In fact, everyone who will either make money or save money from evading network controls would rather be able to claim that they did not know. So while I think JSON is a better approach than HTTPS, and I think Dan Wing is doing great work, I think that it's not going to be deployed. And this is hand in glove with Bill's observation, although it's a slightly different take on what amounts to the same thing. Browser vendors want to make money or save money. They do not want to make it possible for them to do neither. And so we should push forward with these because it would be better to have a standard that works in a lab and could have worked broadly at some future time when we're debating sort of why we gave control of our future to people who did not have the end users' interests in mind. I also call your attention to RFC 8890, which uses the end user as an excuse to do all of these things. Thank you.
Yes, I was going to mention RFC 8890, so you beat me to it, Paul. But yeah, well said. And I can see Joey wants to come in. So do you want to unmute Joey?
Absolutely, thank you. From one of those points that Paul made about deniability, I was just wondering. I think like we have similar situations in lots of different aspects of the internet. Like for example, illegal downloads. Like when people get fined when they get a fine for downloading something illegally, like a torrenting a movie or something, either they get a notification before they get fined, or they don't get a notification, but they still get fined. So I'm kind of thinking that even though I really understand that point of deniability for some particular sectors more than others, I think that those particular sectors that would suffer more from this lack of deniability would already be penalized regardless. Sorry about the background noise. So then I still think that actually giving them information would still be a positive, since in those particular cases, like when they are already in trouble for being dissidents or something, like more information to them would actually be better than no information at all, still, in my point of view. I'm not sure what you guys think. And I also wanted just to echo what Dan said. He actually used the metaphor that I also wanted to use about malware, and his drafts doing a slightly similar thing. Like just detecting the malware is not actually condoning the malware or creating the malware, right? I just wanted to echo that I support that point of view, that also just detecting the rule that is filtering the content that a person or device can reach does not actually create the rule and does not actually condone it. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, it simply makes it more transparent that it's happening. I think, which in my view is a good thing. Okay, well, so make of that what you will. I mean, there are clearly some complications there, but I mean, but personally, I think if Dan and colleagues are able to make progress through DNSOPs despite the objections, I think that, in my humble opinion, will be a good thing, and certainly in the spirit of RFC 8890. Going back to Paul's point about the internet being for the end user, at least that's what the IAB said about 12 months or so, 18 months ago. Anyway, well, those are the two topics that I was keen to raise this week. So thank you for your sort of views on those. Is there anything burning on anyone else's mind that you would like to bring up whilst we're convened this week? don't know if Bill wants to put the link into his crowdfunding for the Quad 9 legal costs, or indeed John for that matter, and the ongoing saga of the German courts. Peter, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I just have a small request. A while ago, I posted a thread on Twitter, which I called Rule 53, which is, if you can think of it, then someone's done it in the DNS. And it's sort of about the weird and wacky things that people have done over DNS. And I put together a little talk, and I was hoping to invite anybody who had heard of anything weird or unusual that has been done over DNS to let me know. My email address is peter@dnsfilter.com. I'm PGL on Twitter, and this thread is pinned, so I don't know if anybody can help me find the strange things that people have done, because it's kind of fun. Thanks, that's it.
Be reasonably confident that some of the people on this call will be aware of some weird things that have been done on DNS.
Yeah, if I can make it interesting or good enough, then I'm hoping to kind of do a little preview here for you guys, but we'll see. I still got to put it together properly. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, thanks, Peter. So anything from anyone else? I see Peter's put his email in the chat.
Sorry, can I ask one question to Dan?
Yeah, surely.
Thank you. Dan, I was just wondering, last minute, you mentioned a few minutes ago that you received good support on the two, well, mostly on one of the drafts, and that currently there's nothing specifically or no specific requirements in terms of support or something. I was just wondering, from this last DNSOP meeting, how do you feel about the opposition that the draft received about those arguments? Like, do you think?
Yeah. So in my presentation, I was just talking. I just talked about the draft and where we are with it. I didn't go back to how we got here and why we're here, which I kind of touched on a little bit here at this meeting, which is this all breaks if you try to, quote unquote, try to give this error information to the user by pointing them at a host that you own, where you display HTML that explains the problem because of HTTPS. I didn't explain that. I didn't explain that the internet's for the end users. We haven't relied and pushed on that really hard yet. And basically all the stuff that came with our earlier HTML draft needs to become part of the structured document. Right now we were just kind of pointing off to it, but I didn't bring this all back to bear. But I mean, we had some of the objections, included, let's spin up another working group and make sure we get cross area attention and review to it and all this sort of thing. And I've been there, heard this before on other stuff I've worked on in IETF. I think that like Paul had mentioned, the ship has sailed on the filtering. RPZ has been around forever as a nice example. And there's opposition, and there will be forever on where to do and why to do filtering. And I think we can overcome that. Filtering happens. We're not doing it with anything I'm proposing. It's just we're enlightening why it's happening. So it's the argument about filtering shouldn't happen. I would say it doesn't belong to us, and the current state of the art is so bad and so harmful to the end user that I expect we can overcome those objections.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And while we've been talking, I can see John has helpfully posted the a link to the Quad 9 versus Sony Music in the German courts, and why DNS resolver operators probably shouldn't be responsible for scanning the entire internet to spot any copyright infringement, which is definitely worth a read if you have a moment. Just because
I would love to say more, but I'm going to hold my tongue until I've got more discussions with our lawyers. But I think it's going to be interesting to a larger DNS community than even just this call, and actually to a larger audience than even just DNS. But we'll have more on that shortly. Yeah.
And not that I've seen a recording of it yet, but Bill was on a call hosted by the jointly by the BCS and the Internet Society in England 2 or 3 weeks ago now, I think, Bill, which sort of covered some of the background of this, which was, as I say, I will include a link to that as soon as I find one, because it was I found it a very interesting conversation, and definitely worth listening to. Right, well, I think we're just past the hour, so hopefully that was generally interesting to people. A reminder, we won't have a call this time next week, as I'll be being rained on in North Wales, which I'm sure will be marvellous and invigorating in its own way. But the plan is in 2 weeks' time, we will mainly concentrate on ECH, plus no doubt anything else which is then topical, well, whatever that might be in a couple of weeks' time. So have a fantastic 2 weeks in the meantime, everyone. Thanks for your time, and we'll sort of convene again in a couple of weeks, same time. Thanks all.
Bye all.
Thanks, guys.
It's been lovely. Take care.